welcome back. For the final session, this is your third panel in this wonderful conference, and it's a pleasure to see you all here, of course. My name is Jennifer Gates Foster, and I'm a professor in the Department of Classics and Archaeologist, and it was my pleasure to be here to help moderate things this afternoon at Gates Invitations, so thank you for that. Without further delay, I want to just remind our speakers that we'll be aiming for the 15 to 20 minute range in the papers, as we have been all day, with a few minutes for discussion, questions from the audience, and then a switch over of speakers. So if we can try to stick to that, then we'll all be happy. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker for today's session, which of course is GIS and the Power of Rome, aka the Historians Panel, as Gabe described. So welcome to that. We're all glad to see it. All right, so our first speaker today is Amanda Kohls. Amanda is with us from Illinois Wesleyan. She is an assistant professor there, and she has a number of irons in the fire. First and foremost, though, of course, is her book project, about which we'll be hearing more in a moment, called Gods, Landscapes, and Community, a Network Approach to Mid-Republican Colonization, which is intersecting with her work at the University of Pennsylvania, where she completed her PhD with Kim Gray not that long ago. So I'll introduce Amanda and turn things over to her. Thank you.
Thank you for allowing me to speak to you today. I'm very excited to be here. I was very excited to hear the earlier panels on how these kinds of information is being produced. And I think I will change the tone a little bit and give you a reuser's report. What is someone doing with the stuff that you're giving us on the internet? So, I'm talking about success in battle, success in building, an ArcGIS model of roads, campaigns, and colonies in Republican Italy. This is coming out of my broader interest in religion in the colonies and my great frustration with the notion that Romans used colonies in order to found their empire and expand. Like, colonies are these little things that help Rome control everything. So my question was, what over time is the relationship between battles, so success militarily, and founding colonies and building roads? And so I'm using the map tools that are being produced so widely in order to examine this historical question. So today what I want to do is tell you a little bit about my methodology, a very simple methodology compared to some we've seen today. I'll talk a little bit about the state of battles and imperialism, both ancient and modern. I will show you the maps that I've made so far and talk about my early observations, and then I will share with you where I hope to take this project in the future. I'd like at this point in time to give you the caveat that we've heard a lot about groups of people, collaborations, institutes, all of these things. I am just me, and I had for 1 month a student to help me. So this is what one person can do on a secondary project using maps. I look forward to whatever feedback that you can give to help me with this project. All right, what am I doing? I've chosen to use ArcGIS primarily because my institution had a subscription to this. And so I was able to get access to ArcGIS without expenditure, and that was delightful for me. I rely heavily on places in Pleiades. Thank you very much for updating that database if you ever have. I'm using a free map resource from Diva GIS because I just need the outline of Italy at this point in time to see what is going on between battles and roads and colonies. Later I might refine to talk a little bit more about the topography of every place. Of course, not every site I need is in Pleiades. They're very responsible about telling you what sites we can actually say are in exact places. So I look, of course, at the Barrington Atlas, but I also use Polyvasova and even go back to Smith, because Smith is not shy about saying, we think that this colony is in this place. And as long as I can get within 30 kilometers or so of where a battle might have been, it can give me a relationship with the battles that are around it and also with the colonies. Because I'm looking at the whole map of Italy, not just one valley. Okay, so I can have that fudge factor there. There are source problems though. So, in order to avoid marking boundaries, and in order to get the enemies that Rome had, where Livy doesn't say the battle was here against these people, I incorporate into each of my maps the enemies that Livy talks about. And later on, I will include other authors, but for now I'm just working with Livy at this time. So I mapped the Roman enemies here from 510 to the 170s, where they're mentioned without specific battles. The gray circles just give us an idea of where they are without forcing us to think about boundaries specifically. For the battles themselves, I used the lovely color schemes that you guys are talking about, but even on a lower level. So what I have here are red X's for Roman losses. They did happen. I have green X's for a simple and one-time Roman win, if such a thing could be a simple thing. The more interesting part are the blue X's and the black X's here. So the black X's you'll see later. Black X's are where in a decade-long period you have multiple battles, and the Romans actually lost quite a lot before they won. And so if I didn't tell you when that happened, then you wouldn't know that the Romans lost ever, except for those few little red X's, most of which Hannibal did. And they don't seem to be that analytical overall. So the black X's are within one decade. A blue X is the particular locations where the Romans had battles with their enemies over decades, sometimes within just 50-year period. Sometimes they fight there once in the 5th century and again in the 2nd century. But it's a place where multiple confrontations occur. So, the battles, the roads, the colonies that I'm looking at have the basic historical question about imperialism. So, we always have to start with Polybius, who is a contemporary observer of Roman imperialism, if we can say Romans are imperialistic. But Polybius comments for his Greek audience that Rome prodigiously dominated the known world in 53 years, something that had never happened before, although we all tend to think about Alexander the Great and his conquering as well. So Polybius is following the very Greek tradition of talking about 50-year periods and great dominations. I'm not going to try to cover everything Polybius does, but I am going to look at the Italian peninsula and the period from the beginning of the Republic to 177 to examine what it actually means to fall under Roman power for this period in this place. Imperialism, as you guys know, is a Roman word that means a sphere, a power to command an army, and it eventually also indicated the territory where command happened. Imperium is a military word for the Romans, but imperialism is a modern word which gained popularity in economic spheres in the 1870s. We've since had many theories on imperialism. And so for those of you who don't look into the Romans as much as I do, here's a cheat sheet for you. Mommsen, of course, followed by Tenny Frank in the early 20th century, espoused something called defensive imperialism, which is basically the view that the Romans did not intend to build an empire, but reluctantly entered into conflicts because of threats to Rome or her allies. And this has been discounted largely since then. But in that model, it was only after the mid-1st century, so Caesar about, that the Romans pursued imperialism more aggressively. This is coming very much out of notions of British imperialism at the time. Harris talked instead about the competition among elite and Roman, the elite Romans and Roman militarism as a whole. And you can break that down in several ways. For example, Cornell points to Roman aggression as the reason that there were so many wars. And so the wars against the Samnites that I'll talk about later, those were because the Romans were the aggressive parties, not because the Samnites were something that they could not help but oppose. Rich also talks about elite competition and fear of the Gauls, of course. But basically, his competition is that the Roman elite are trying to restrict their rivals' opportunities to triumph, to gain popularity, to gain the next election. So these are the types of authors that are following Ennius, or Ennius seems to situate this in a Hellenistic tradition for us. What do I mean by that? Ennius, of course, in the 2nd century BCE, writing his lovely poetry, focusing on what happens in the Roman mind when you start talking about war. So basically, you're no longer wise, you're no longer good orators, you're no longer smart, you're just going to swear at each other and try to take as much territory as possible. These theories are all focused on Rome. They're all Romanocentric. So Eckstein provides an anodyne to that. when he espouses that Rome was struggling for survival in a competitive geopolitical environment. So all other Hellenistic societies are, well, not all, Hellenistic societies also are militaristic, also are expanding. And right now I'm only looking at Rome and Italy, but in the future I hope to expand so that I can see other battles in Italy, other battles throughout the Mediterranean, to show this overall aggression that's occurring at this time. So how do I get to all of this? I start with the roads and colonies as building, as ways that the Romans can take the territory if that's what they're doing. Roads, according to Livy, are built by soldiers. You don't want the soldiers to get fractious, you set them to building a road, you can get to the next battle faster, and also your soldiers will be occupied when they're not in battle themselves. So there's a clear connection in the Roman mind of the late Republic between war and roads. For my roads, I follow Lawrence and Bradley, and right now they are at a very low level of I hand drew them. Because if you do it from city to city through the Pleiades site, you lose a lot of the landscape capabilities there. So another caveat for you right there, the roads are hand drawn. In the future, I hope to make them a little bit more precise. Again, we're centered on Rome, and this is just roads. This doesn't talk about social or political networks. It doesn't talk about embassies or alliances. So that's a caveat for this particular road network. The thing that I care most about, however, are the colonies. So these are mapped based on excerpts from Livy and Velleius Paterculus with analysis by Salmon, Lauchner, Chiaba, and others. So later on, you're going to see blue triangles for the earliest colonies. This schema happens after 338. It's a modern schema, coming out of Livy's terms for these colonies. And so the little green Coloniae Maritimae are 300 families set on of Roman citizens set on the coasts. The little blue diamonds are 2,000 or more people that are given Latin status in relationship to Rome, set wherever they need to be. And then these purple ones are split between the two, 2,000 or more families of Roman citizens that happen later on. This is, I use this schema, although sometimes it is also problematic. All right, so Cicero calls these colonies in the late Republic, looking back on the earlier Republic, he calls these bulwarks of empire. So if you look at Polybius, if you look at Livy, if you look at Cicero, these guys have already witnessed a Roman in command of a sizable empire. And you might conclude just on the ancient sources that the Romans built roads and founded colonies as a direct result of military campaigns and for the purpose of promoting an imperialist policy during every phase of the Roman Republic. Recent studies on colonization, however, argue there was a much more variation in the nature of early colonization schemes. So it begs the question of whether Roman expansion or even imperialism was static over time as well. Now I want to quickly flip us through the maps I've made. And I hardly need to caution this audience about maps, but I'm going to. So the problems I'm aware of right now, of course, there's spatial problems. Not every place can be mapped, and I've estimated, as I've warned you, where some are, because I need the relationship, not the absolute location. Temporally, there's a gap in Livy, and also other sources are also fragmentary. There's also that 4-year discrepancy between Livy and Polybius in the 4th century. So I've arranged my maps in decades so that this flattens that problem just a little bit. And finally, we are centered again on Rome, unfortunately. Significant military and colonizing activity is going on concurrently by other peoples in other places in Italy that I have not yet mapped. Okay, so maps. As I said, I'm using ArcGIS at a low level to see these things change over time. In the 510s, beginning of the empire, or beginning of the Republic, excuse me, the Romans are fighting with their nearest neighbors. Where they found colonies, it's often where their allies are rebelling against them. And the rebellions continue after the colonies are founded. At this period, the Romans are also founding colonies with the help of their Latin allies, not from their own volition. And so in these very earliest, this first half century, there's no senatorial roads yet. The enemies are Rome's nearest neighbors, and this is where mapping other groups will help us see a situation better. In the 400s to 350s, the 450s to 400s, we again see more very battles close to Rome, a lot of victories close to Rome, and not very much colonization outside of Latium, where the Latin colonists are just joined the alliance of Romans and Latins. In the early 4th century, we start to get a little bit further afield. This is also when the sack of Veii occurred. The Aequi were defeated during this time. And the Romans participated in the 380s in 5 colonial foundations despite the Gallic sack on Rome. So there's a lot going on for the Romans, but they're still helping to found colonies during this time. Incidentally, these are the last decades where the Romans will be founding colonies cooperatively with their allies. We get into the 350s, and we shift down to Samnite Wars and the Latin War in 340. And it's this period in time where the Romans will take over primary responsibility for colonization. The Romans are generally victorious during these decades, although with the notable defeats such as at the Caudine Forks and others during the Samnite Wars. And the colonies seem to react to continuing battles with the Samnites for these decades. Many colonies are founded in Campania, where Roman allies have been asked for help against the Samnites. And it's only in the 4th century, in 312, where we get the first censorial road, the Via Appia, built to Campania. Our sources tell us that this was very controversial because of the popularity it would give Appius Claudius Caecus. And so the military benefit for the Roman state seemed to come second to the political power it would grant its founder. Bradley observes also that the Via Valeria, founded by probably Valerius Maximus in 307, did not follow battles or colonies, but presaged them. So it was founded just before the extermination of the Aequi in 304. The colonies at Alba Fucens were founded in 303 and Curcioli in 298. And Bradley concludes that it does seem that this road did presage the conquest, annexation, and definitive organization of the territory. And I mention this because later roads seem to respond to colonies afterwards. The road comes after the colonies. Okay. So, continuing on with Samnite Wars, we also get the Pyrrhic War. So these roads here are the ones that seem to be following where the colonies go, rather than going before the colonies and paving the way, as it were. Sorry, that was horrible. For the colonies. Okay. The battles in the early 3rd century are much more mixed in their success. Where the Romans won in the end, they lost as well quite a bit along the way. In the 280s, as we saw, the Romans punched those 2 more roads through the north and east and found colonies along the Adriatic during this time. Latin colonies both on the Adriatic and in Samnium also come in these next few decades. Finally, in the end of the 3rd century, we have a lacuna in our text, so it's not very exciting in terms of battles, until we get to, of course, Hannibal marching throughout Italy. So here there are a lot of Roman defeats, unfortunately. And Eckstein comments that we shouldn't expect the Romans to be imperialistic until after the Pyrrhic Wars in 280. But I argue that the mapped patterns I've been seeing don't show imperialism until perhaps the early 2nd century, so after Hannibal has marched through. And I argue this because these roads, as I mentioned, don't pass through all colonies, nor are all colonies founded on new roads. Sometimes the roads come first, sometimes the colonies do, sometimes there are colonies well away from any major building project. So this suggests to me that the two are not part of an overall imperial plan. If they were, they would work a little bit more systematically together. The last couple roads here, this is the point in time where we start seeing what I would call actual deliberate expansion. But it's at the hands of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who founded these large citizen colonies and pushed roads through, and also expanded territories, gave territory to Roman citizen colonists outside of colonies as well. And we don't have as many battles for this period, just the notion that they were fighting against the Ligurians. Overall, I feel that the mapping exercise that I've done is already fruitful because it illustrates different relationships between roads, colonies, and campaigns over time. It helps strip away the lens of late Republican or early imperial authors like Livy or Cicero. Recent scholarship on colonization efforts demonstrates that there were several distinct phases of colonization during the Republic. Especially in the early Republic, founding colonies was not necessarily a state-sponsored activity, but a private enterprise that might not have had anything to do with the army. And early maps seem to corroborate this. The Romans didn't expand beyond their neighboring territories. They were part of an existing, if not peaceful, network of allies in Latium and Etruria, and the colonies were added as allies to this network, but the early colonies continued to fight against Rome. If that is an imperialist policy, it's one that's not working. The 4th century, the Romans were invited by Campanian allies to engage with the hostile Samnites. Roads and colonies responded to this sphere of influence, not just to surround the Samnites, though. Roads and colonies don't seem to be part of a set policy of annexation at this time. And then for the 3rd century, Roman wars often left the boundaries of Italy, so the action's not happening in Italy, except for Hannibal, of course. And it's only in this early 2nd century that individuals like Marcus Aemilius Lepidus pushed through an apparent expansionist policy. So those are my early observations, and what I want to do next is collect more data. So I want to map elements to the end of the Republic and on the islands. I want to specify different battle types. Is it a skirmish or just horsemen going at it? Was there a siege? I would like to capture every location in the primary sources, which will take me time. Beyond battles, we have other networks. We have treatises, truces, and different juridical statuses. I'm hoping that mapping these types of things can tell us more about what's going on with the Ager Romanus, the territory that Romans actually control. And finally, I do want to look at other population movements. The Ligurians going to Samnium, and of course get beyond Rome for as much as possible. So I'd appreciate whatever feedback that you can give me. I apologize for going over on time, and thank you for listening.